So I got to thinking about something the other day, and that's debut records, right? A lot of times people say the first record was the best. They should have quit while they're ahead. Nothing compares to that first record. And you can think of multiple cases of this, right? And think about your favorite artists from the 70s, 80s, 90s, probably today too. A lot of times it's that first record is going to be your favorite. If not your favorite, it's going to be in your top three. But when you think of the early 60s or mid 60s, that is seldom the case. I realized this recently when merging my collection with my girlfriend's. She's got a lot of things I don't have and certainly fills in some gaps on some artists that I absolutely love. And I found it kind of interesting that some of these bands that I would list as possible, in my top 10 or top 20 of favorite artists of all time, I don't really know their first records that well. And so I decided to kind of listen to them and, I don't know, figure out why that is. And also, I found the whole thing really interesting that you hardly ever hear anybody tell you that, for example, their favorite, Kinks record is the first Kinks record. Nobody says that. Why? I think a lot of this is that music was developing so quickly for these bands. They're part of the British invasion, and they all kind of sounded this similar at the time. They were all getting going. They were adopting American blues and early rock and roll as a template, and had sort of this garagey, what we consider now garagey kind of sound to them. I think most of them recorded very quickly. They didn't use a recording studio as much of an art form. They weren't writing in the recording studio and using it. That developed a few years later. So you find these records that they're good, but it's like almost like the training wheels are on. The Kinks don't sound like the Kinks here. They do. I mean, to be fair, "You Really Got Me" is on here, and that's probably the most well-known Kinks song of all. So of course, that sounds like the Kinks. But a lot of tracks on here, I didn't know of. I'm guessing most people wouldn't either. "Stop Your Sobbing," another original's on here, which I think is great. But so many of these songs, I didn't know if Ray or Dave was singing them. I didn't know if they're covers or originals. I think most of it is covers, although about 5 or 6 of the songs are originals. But you're never going to hear the Kinks' first record as someone's favorite. If it is your favorite, I would love to hear from you, and I'd love to know what makes it your favorite. Usually, you're going to hear Village Green or Face to Face or Arthur or Muswell Hillbillies, which on some days, depending on the day, I guess for me or week, would be my favorite. But absolutely love the Kinks. Didn't know their first record. Okay, let's go on to another one here. The Rolling Stones. People are excited about the new Rolling Stones record, Hackney Diamonds, I think it's called. They're teasing it out. I'm curious about it for sure. I feel like it might be a good one because they've really taken their time on it. It's been a number of years, and it most likely, could be their last. I would think that it might be actually a really good Rolling Stones record, so I'm excited about it. But I bet I'm not alone. I bet there's a lot of people that are really excited about their Rolling Stones record, the new one, but have never heard their first record. Now, I had heard this before and it's been in my collection for years, but I never really paid much attention to it. And I played it again, probably played it 3 times getting ready for this video, and it's good. It sounds much like the Kinks record, like the very beginning of a band. Sounds more like Mick Jagger and backing musicians, England's newest hit makers. Yeah, it sounds like they're being marketed as like this pop group, which they were, but the sound is just not there. There's a bunch of Chuck Berry, early rock and roll kind of covers on it, Not Fade Away, Route 66, Carol. There's some songs on here, unlike the Kinks, outside of maybe You Really Got Me, that they did continue playing into their set for several years. But I think there's 1 or 2 original songs on there. Tell Me is one of them by the Stones. Not one of their best, but probably maybe would be recognizable to some people. But yeah, not one that you would ever really call your favorite. But if they had come out in the 70s, even late 60s, look at the Velvet Underground, look at Jimi Hendrix, look at Black Sabbath, you know, even Pink Floyd. Some people say Piper at the Gates of Dawn is their favorite. Certainly seems like they really captured something in a way that this album doesn't, right? bands became, I guess, more locked into their sound, or this fidelity in the recording studio had gotten to the point. And these bands paved the way too, right, for a lot of these other bands that came later. But you'll hear, listen to bands from late '60s on. A lot of times, their first record might be their best. You never really hear that with bands from the early '60s. They were developing. Their first album is not their best. I'd love to hear some examples of the case where that would be true. And I know I'm just covering on the four absolute giants here. Fifth, I got a bonus one artist in here too. But, there's bands like the Animals and the Zombies that I think fit the same kind of criteria. But I'd be curious what other artists there are out there that maybe break the rule that their first album absolutely is their best, but still are in the kind of this British invasion, early mid '60s scene. Okay, so the next one, I don't have the record. So, The Who, My Generation. That record. Now, of course, we know My Generation, and I think that might be it for the songs that I knew. Much like the Kings, I would not recognize the singer, especially in the band by extension, if I heard them on Sirius XM's Underground Garage, where they play a lot of this music, a lot of classic rock, classic garage rock type stuff. I wouldn't necessarily know it was a Who. I wouldn't necessarily know it was the Stones. I actually like this of these four records. Well, there's another one I really like too, but My Generation I kind of liked because I'm getting into more of the early Who. I listened to a quick one the other day and absolutely loved it. And I played it before, but not that often, really at all. Didn't really know it. So there was a part of it that I really liked in a different way with My Generation. Don't need to hear that song really ever again. It's been played to death, I think. But again, I would not know, who that artist is if it came on randomly, one of those deeper cuts. And I'm pretty positive most people aren't going to say that's their favorite Who record. They're going to say Who's Next, Tommy, Quadrophenia, maybe Sell Out. But again, if it's your favorite, I'd love to hear from you. I think it's probably different for people that were around when these albums were new, right? If you got into the Who when that record came out, my God, if you saw them live or something, I could see why that would be your favorite. But for those of us that got into them a little later, or in some cases a lot later, I don't think that's really true at all. We I think all but ignore these records. All right, the next one is the big heavy hitter of the bunch. Please Please Me by the Beatles. I confess, I love the Beatles, but I never listened to this record until I merged my collection with my girlfriend's. Looking at her stuff, I didn't have this record. I mean, I had streamed it before, but I really never really cared about it. I mean, the Beatles to me don't really get interesting until you get into Help, and Rubber Soul, and Revolver, and on and on and on. I mean, if you ask somebody what their favorite Beatles record is, a lot of times, I mean, it kind of depends on the era we're in. Now it seems like everybody's saying that Abbey Road is. Before that, it was Revolver. Before that, it was, I don't know, Sergeant Pepper, and I'm sure the White Album was in there. But this album is interesting. I mean, it's the Beatles as a rock band, or a pop band, I guess. Boy band, as some people would say. I don't know if that's really that accurate, but it's pretty much sounds like a live record. It was recorded, I guess, in one day, which is pretty impressive. They definitely pay their dues playing live shows. Liverpool, we know all of that. Hamburg. But again, it's never, I doubt very many people will say it's their favorite Beatles record. I found it really interesting, and I think this comes out more fully baked than the other records. It definitely sounds like the Beatles, but at the same time, for me, there were several songs in here I was not familiar with. And occasionally that happens because they just don't pay that much attention to these early Beatles records. With the Beatles, this one, even A Hard Day's Night. I think I'm going to do another video where I really go in depth on those and listen to them with the kind of attention that I've given, Rubber Soul and Revolver over the years. But I do find it a really good record. I do one thing I think is really interesting about the Beatles is, like, okay, if I saw them in 1966, like their last show, I would think that show would be full of songs off of Help and Rubber Soul and really interesting, and it's not. It's a lot of stuff that's this kind of stuff. It's Please Please Me. It's I Saw Her Standing There, Twist and Shout. That kind of stuff dominates quite a bit. So anyway, They're definitely had like their template for material on here going forward for several years. Of course, every album they improved at lightning speed pretty much. But is it someone's favorite? Does it get listed as a favorite? Probably not. But again, compare it to other times, other decades, other artists that came later. Their first albums are often being cited as their best. And last but not least, I didn't include this at first, but I find it kind of interesting too. Bob Dylan. Okay, he's not part of the British invasion. He's the U.S. He's a singer songwriter, kind of a folky. Came out in 1962. Does anybody call this Bob Dylan record their favorite? Kind of doubt it. It has a kind of a cool sound to it. I mean, he looks like a little baby on the cover, just a little kid. I don't think he looks older than 14 on there. Um, but it's a good record, but it's a whole different, like it's more of the just covering folk songs and blues songs. And I think you've got song for Woody or song to Woody's on there, which is absolutely incredible. And I love the House of the Rising Sun version that's on here. But again, you're not going to hear people call this Bob Dylan record their favorite. But flash forward to John Prine, a lot of people say that self-titled record is their favorite of his. So I just found that really interesting, that observation. And I'm gonna, like I said, probably go back and listen to some of these earlier records by artists that I absolutely love that I just have not really paid that much attention to. Thanks, everyone.